All right, it's 6:30. Do we want to wait another moment or two, or you think we're good to get going here?
Seeing a couple of people. I'll give it a minute.
All right. And then Jen, if you can just double check the attendee list, make sure we don't need to bring anyone else over. That'd be great. And we're doing this a little bit differently tonight. We had a little bit of a mix-up. If you are out there and you need to be a panelist or presenter, go ahead and hit the raise hand button now. Just want to make sure we don't miss anybody.
Yeah, Matt, you could bring Eleni.
Ah, that's right. I knew one of the names looked familiar.
Yep.
Bring you back, Eleni. She was on right at 6 o'clock and gave her a reprieve to go get a bite to eat or something. Okay, well, everything looks good. Whenever we're ready to go, we can go ahead and jump in. Recording has started.
Okay, is that my cue?
That's your cue. You want to
All
get
right.
going?
Well, welcome everyone. This is our second public meeting for this project. We hit a bit of a slowdown when the pandemic hit. So it's been a while since we've got together, but this past fall, we kind of rebooted this project, got it going again in earnest, and we are now back. And tonight we'll be presenting some draft alternatives for everyone to consider and discuss. Hopefully everyone had a chance to watch the recorded video in advance. I think that'll really help you out. But if not, I think you'll be able to follow along reasonably well. And just a real quick, this study is funded by the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission with federal transportation dollars. It was requested by the city of Burlington as part of our annual work program. And so they are contributing a local match to that. And we've hired VHB as our consultant to take care of this work. And also Diane Meyerhoff with Third Sector Associates to take care of the public involvement. Hopefully you've received some emails from her, and that's why you knew about this meeting and are here joining us tonight. And I don't think I have anything else to add, unless anyone else has some intro stuff. Nicole, if you want, feel free. If not, give it right over to Drew to kick this off.
I think I'm all set. Thanks for kicking us off. And yeah, let's turn it over to Drew.
All right. Thank you, Jason and Nicole, for the introduction there. And yep, just to bring everybody in, this is our Colchester Avenue Bikeways, Parking, and Intersection Safety Study. So in order to hold plenty of space for discussion tonight, we want to remind you that the presentation slide that we're presenting here and a pre-recorded version of the presentation are also available on the website. And we encourage you to visit those materials, as we'll be skipping through the project purpose and need and a bit of a project refresher in the interest of getting through the corridor concepts and alternatives evaluation, and most importantly, to your public comment. So just a quick reintroduction of the team here. As Jason kicked us off here, him and his colleague Marshall Distel are with the CCRPC. We also have Nicole Loesch and Elizabeth Ross from the city of Burlington on the project team, and then representing the consultant team here with VHB is myself, Jen Conley, and Karen Sentoff. And also on this slide, you'll see the list of names of our advisory committee. A number of members, I'm sure, are among us tonight. And just a quick reintroduction to the project scope and schedule. So back in December of 2019, we had our first public meeting, which was our local concerns meeting, followed by a couple advisory committee meetings mixed in along with our alternatives assessment. We then did have a bit of a project hiatus due to managing and navigating, as I'm sure everyone has been doing so, the COVID-19 pandemic. And now we are resuming public outreach process for this project today with the alternatives presentation meeting, and followed by this will be a development of the preferred alternative, as well as a third and final advisory committee meeting, and then draft of the scope and a presentation to the city council. I'm going to send it over to my colleague, Karen.
Thanks, Drew. So what you're seeing on the screen now is really the guide for this presentation. We'll be going through the alternatives, basically from left to right on this screen here. So we'll start with the western end of the corridor of Colchester Avenue, sort of west of East Avenue, then move on to concepts east of East Avenue. And then to bring it home, we'll talk through the alternatives for the intersection with Colchester Avenue and East Avenue.
Karen, before you begin, should we just share that if folks need to ask a clarifying question, that they can do so in the question and answer pod? And I will, alert either Drew or Karen, whoever's speaking, that there's a clarifying question, but we are going to wait for feedback until the presentation is complete.
Yep, and so quickly after we get through each section here, sort of represented as the columns in this table, we will pause for a moment to make sure that there aren't any further clarifying questions, because we understand there is a lot of content here, and so we'll sort of go section by section and just make sure that everyone sort of has a good grasp on what we're presenting and the information regarding each segment of the corridor. We understand it's a long corridor, so stick with us. So
Karen, again, I apologize. Jack raised his hand. Jack, could I steer you to the question and answer pod? If you can't locate that, that is down in the middle of your screen, at the bottom of your screen. For now, we're just going to take kind of questions through the question and answer pod instead of by raising hands. Sorry, Karen.
No problem. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is just really a reference slide for folks who have been following along with the project sort of prior to the hiatus that we took with the pandemic. And it's just regarding the naming convention that we were using for some of the concepts that we had evaluated very early on in the process. So really just for reference. All right, so we're going to start with the western end of the corridor, sort of west of East Avenue, between Prospect Street and East Ave. And we're going to look first at Concept 1 West, which is on-street separated bike lanes. And here you're seeing Concept 1 West in cross-section at the top and then plan view at the bottom for that first section between Prospect and the hospital entrance. Some important features to note in this section include that we are shifting curbs to better accommodate those bicycle lanes with a buffer and a vertical element. Here we're also holding the back of sidewalk to the existing back of sidewalk, so there's really not any implications in terms of right of way beyond the back of sidewalk than what's out there today. And the newly constructed shared use path on the south side that we're all pretty excited about is flanked by a narrow green belt in this option with on-street bike lanes having that 3-foot buffer and that vertical element such as a bollard. And here we're seeing a continuation of that concept from the previous slide. So this is between UVM Medical Center entrance and East Avenue. For now, let's ignore the treatment at the intersection and really just focus on the cross section here. Understanding that, again, we're holding that space for the 3-foot buffer with the bike lane, so better accommodating that bike lane along this section. We're holding the back of sidewalk where we can, but in some places we're going as far as 4 feet back from the existing back of sidewalk. And again, here we're seeing that newly constructed side path on the south side continues along this stretch.
All right. Thanks, Karen. And just as a reminder to everybody, at the end of this western section, we will have any slight pause for any clarifying questions, but for now we're going to continue to proceed with the concept. So now we're going to look at concept 2 for the west end of the corridor, which is the concept including raised and separated bike lanes. So as you'll see in the cross section and the layout, the bike lanes in this case are both horizontally and vertically separated from the roadway. This design will also have a slight vertical separation from the sidewalk to clearly define space for each user. We kind of have a sample photograph. It's slightly hard to tell the vertical delineation between the sidewalk and the raised bike lane, but we're talking a very slight change of grade just to emphasize that separation. There is enough width here to call for grass strips wide enough on both sides to allow for new tree plantings. And even with the widened grass strip, the area of impact does not extend, similar to concept 1, beyond the existing back of sidewalk. And just given the vertical separation in this case, being the main difference between concept 1 and 2, there's naturally more space for bikes and peds to operate separate from traffic. Continuing along this section, the grass strip does narrow. However, there's still space for a key feature in this concept being separated space or the creation of space to allow for left turns for bicyclists. And during our local concerns meeting back in December of 2019, there was a clear desire for improving conditions for bicyclists along the corridor, particularly in the realm of left turns onto and off of the corridor. And so this concept accomplishes that while keeping turning bicyclists separate from vehicle traffic and separate horizontally from through bicyclist traffic. So that's kind of the first two concepts here for concept 2 west. And so as is the case with these sort of studies, we then like to do side-by-side comparisons. And so in order to better understand the impact and implication of these design concepts, we've developed this evaluation matrix to compare side by side the critical concept factors such as cost, safety impacts, and impact to the community character. These cost evaluations are presented on a high-level relative cost scale. So for these, the big cost generators are, in both cases, both concepts are moving the curb and widening the roadway. And as we've mentioned, these are generally significant reconstruction efforts because, as has been touched on in previous public outreach efforts, the short-term changes to Colchester Avenue, the project team feels are what's currently out there with the recent side path improvements, as well as the striped bike lane and enhanced pedestrian treatments at some crossings. The larger cost seen here, indicated by the third dollar sign for concept 2, comes from the design implications of raising the bike lanes to near sidewalk grade, as opposed to concept 1, which carries striped but vertically separated bike lanes within the existing cartway of the road. Looking at safety, these two concepts provide protected and separated facilities for all modes using this corridor, being pedestrians, bicyclists, and vehicles. As a result, we see improvements to safety across the board. The main difference, as we have covered between concept 1 and 2, in particular for bicyclist safety, is that we see concept 2 potentially being more apt to pull in the quote unquote interested but concerned type of cyclists. With the on-street separated facilities, as there still is a certain level of perceived exposure from vehicle traffic when you are on the same grade, whereas these users are more likely to be comfortable, we think, raised and separated from vehicle traffic. The concepts see improvements to pedestrian safety as well, because bicyclists currently using the shared use path along the south side of the road now have an exclusive facility to operate in. Looking at the impacts, you'll notice similar impacts between the two concepts across the board. We assess these impacts against all of the number of things you see here: existing utilities, right-of-ways, overall thoughts on constructability, impacts to parking, trees, and then finally any historical or archaeological impacts to the corridor. The two concepts here match up pretty much the same across the board, with the similar impacts to the utilities. It's known that there are above ground utilities along this corridor that would need to be potentially relocated or modified in some way, shape, or form to make sure that these streetscape improvements fit. The right-of-way impacts, there are no impacts to the right-of-way, as Karen touched on. Each concept sees a little bit of a shift of the back of sidewalk, but that still stays within public right-of-way. And then there's no existing parking along the corridor, therefore we don't have any changes to parking. And there could be moderate impacts to some existing trees, but we also are recognizing that the new concepts do present some tree belt opportunity for new plantings. Looking at the community character, concept 1 generally holds the existing aesthetic character of the corridor with the striped bike lanes, however now separated via a buffer and a vertical element. While concept 2 we see as an improvement as the green belt is widening for nearly the full length of the corridor, and in particularly widening west of the UVM Medical Center driveway allows for tree plantings. And then assessing both of these concepts against purpose and need, this checks both of those boxes. So now, before we jump into the eastern section of the corridor, we're looking for any clarifying questions. And again, these are not broad statements or thoughts. We'll save all of the time at the end for those. These are simply if you're a bit confused and just seeking clarification about 1 or 2 of the changes along the corridor, or 1 or 2 of the proposed elements of each of these concepts, we ask that you please use your raised hand feature and we'll unmute you for clarifying questions. Again, please stay away from any grand statements or thoughts at this point. We will have time for that at the end. And then prior to that discussion, we would like to hear from all of our participants about what your initial preference is given the introduction to this concept. So after we do have those clarifying questions, we will show a brief poll to gauge folks' first impressions of the concepts presented.
Drew, the first question is a clarifying question, wondering if the impacts factor in stormwater runoff and how that is evaluated in the evaluation criteria.
Could you say that one more time, Jen? It was in regard to stormwater?
It's in regards to stormwater runoff and whether that has been accounted for in the evaluation criteria.
That has not been part of the evaluation criteria. Generally, that kind of occurs, and somebody please feel free to step in. That kind of occurs in more in the design, the preliminary engineering design phase. That would of course be a consideration because we recognize that with the relocation of curbs, there is a certain amount of stormwater infrastructure that would need to also be relocated. I think you could look to other examples in the city to see some of the kind of common countermeasures that the city has been implementing. I think we could consider some of those along this corridor, but that would be more a question addressed in the preliminary engineering design phase of a project like this.
Is it correct though that the impervious surface in the 2 alternatives is similar, so we would not expect a big difference in the stormwater runoff impact?
Yeah, that's fair to say. We are widening the roadway. However, the implication of additional impervious surface is somewhat mitigated by the inclusion of grass strips and tree buffers along the project corridor.
Okay, one other clarifying question was what is meant by modified tree impact on the north side of the green belt?
Modified impact on trees on the north side of the green belt. Is that, I presume that's referring to the evaluation matrix?
I would assume as much, yes.
Okay, let me just clarify myself. I believe it was moderate impacts was the language used.
Okay. And then there was another question about one version having plantings and one does not. And if I think similar to the stormwater impact, I think the amount of green space in each alternative would be similar. It's just where it's located, correct?
Correct. So that was referring to the width available west of the UVM Medical Center driveway relative to that, which is available to the east. So we have it in our current concepts that there would be 6 feet of available grass strip space west of the UVM Medical Center, which would be wide enough for tree plantings. And then to the east, in the interest of avoiding any private property and right-of-way impacts, we have a narrower grass strip of 4 feet, which generally is not considered sufficient for tree plantings.
And then finally, there is a question, and I think we got this in some of our preliminary feedback, that has to do with how bus stops will be accommodated with the raised bike lanes. And I believe that's a detail that would be worked out later, but there are examples of how that can be accommodated.
Yep.
Great.
Examples not being presented here, but
No.
there are design examples, yes, in the field that we would absolutely reference and make sure that we are minimizing or mitigating any potential conflicts between bicyclists, pedestrians, and transit users.
In the final clarifying question, oh wait, there's a couple. One is, how do cyclists turn left on the separated raised path?
So that was touched on I can click back to it because it is a bit hard to see. So if you look at, for instance, Fletcher Place, where there's a crosswalk proposed, we're also proposing a bicycle crossing, and you can see a slight shift in the gray area, which is otherwise considered the separated bike lane in this concept, where a bicyclist would pull to the left and then assess traffic and then yield as needed and or operate. I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, this is where an RRFB currently exists, so they could activate the RRFB to then dismount their bike and cross the street, or wait for a gap in traffic to then cross at this crossing location.
There is also one other question about whether we have spoken with GMT, and I can answer that because they do sit on our committee. So we do have some input from GMT as we move through the process. And then there's one question about, you just said something happens in the design phase, but what level is their involvement at this stage? I think that's referring back to GMT. And as I said, they are involved at the committee level. And so we are getting input from them as we go. But obviously those details will be worked out later. And Drew, I think that's it. If you want to go to the poll, and we can move along.
Yeah, I think Matt, I think we'll need to.
All right, yep, I'm gonna go ahead and launch the poll. Everyone out there should just see this pop up on your screen. If you don't see it, go ahead and click the poll button at the bottom. And we've got our first question up. And we've got about 60% voting so far. Let's give it another maybe 15 seconds or so. Okay, we'll give you another 5 seconds or so to go ahead and vote in the poll. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. We've hit a minute. And let me share those results with everybody.
Well, it seems at this end of the quarter, there is a strong preference for concept 2, which is the raised separated bike lanes.
I'm just noticing that Dave has his hand up, and I don't know if he wants to speak. His question wasn't clarified.
Oh.
Dave, would you be able to put a question into the chat, into either the chat or into the question and answer pod?
Looks like he did put his hand down.
Okay,
But,
maybe it was an error when he was responding to something.
Oh, David says, I'm okay. Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Good to be
Okay.
sure.
All right, I'm going to shut down the results of the first poll.
All right. We all set on this section then, Drew?
Yep.
We do have one hand raised now.
Oh.
Jack's hand is raised. Jack, did you have a question you want to put in the, it says my question was answered live, but I don't believe it was. All right, Jack, I apologize if I missed you here. Yeah, I will just allow Jack to talk really quickly just so we can finish off this section.
Okay, Jack, you should be able to unmute now. Go ahead.
Jack, are you able to unmute? I apologize if I missed your question. I can go back.
I'm sorry, Jen. His question was, could the project team explain why it is that raised separated bike lanes are not considered any safer than the on-street lanes in the evaluation matrix?
Sorry,
yeah,
my connection got messed up. Did I miss my window? Sorry.
No, but Matt did just read your question, Jack. I don't know if you did want to repeat it. But it
No, if you
sounds
just
like
read it, that's fine. Yeah,
so why are raised separated bike lanes not considered safer than the on-street separated bike lanes? It's in the case of actual safety, this is why we touched on this the way we did. It's kind of a measure of actual versus perceived safety. Raised separated bike lanes are in actuality very similar in nature to an on-street but still vertically separated bike lane. So we thought it was pertinent to mention that, you know, when you're assessing these two facility types, they are actually, you know, considered equally safe against each other. However, there is the matter of perceived safety, which perhaps is what you're alluding to. And that's why we touched on the interested but concerned population of bicyclists. When they see a raised separated facility that is off the street, we think that that facility is more than likely going to pull in a larger cycling population to use, because they will perceive that it is safer because they see it as, you know, vertically separated from vehicles in addition to being horizontally separated from motorists.
There was one final clarification question on this section, which was how do cyclists go left or straight at East Ave in the raised option? And we'll get into those intersection alternatives in a few minutes. That's the third column, and we'll get to that a little later, Lonnie. So we'll save your question till that time.
Yep. Yeah, we'll circle back to. We're kind of moving left to right, as Karen touched on. So we'll circle back to East Avenue and the alternatives presented there and make sure to hopefully hit on all those things. And then, of course, if we do not after the fact, please feel free to raise that question. We'll be sure to address it. All right, Karen.
All righty. So jumping into the eastern end of the corridor, so this is between East Avenue and Barrett Street, so going down the hill on Colchester Avenue towards the Winooski River. And we'll be starting with Concept 1 East, which will present the on-street separated bike lanes. So similar to Concept 1 West, this is a continuation of that concept, which changes the curb-to-curb width to better accommodate on-street separated bike lanes with buffers and a vertical element. And the key features that you're seeing here, both in plan view and cross section, are that there's a 5-foot bike lane with a 3-foot buffer and a vertical element. In this section, there are a number of driveways, so that vertical element will be limited in terms of where it can be, just to continue to allow access to those driveways. So we'll keep those access points open, but we'll have to limit the number of bollards that can be out there. And although the right-of-way line is wide here, beyond the back of existing sidewalk, we attempted to limit the impacts to those adjacent properties with this concept, and really wanted to limit the impact to that space that folks are using for parking, off-street parking or front yard space. Along this section, there is a minimal green belt. We're really tight through this section. And so the segment between Centennial Entrance and Greenmount Cemetery would have an expanded greenbelt, but the segment in front of the cemetery and heading down the hill would require no greenbelt, just based on the slope limits that were in the field there. And so we'd be limited in terms of the greenbelt space in that section. Moving on to the continuation of that down the hill and down to Barrett Street. Like the previous slide, along this section, we have that 5-foot bike lane with the 3-foot buffer and vertical element. We're showing minimal greenbelt, even though we are well within the right of way, again, to limit those impacts to front yard space and off-street parking to the adjacent properties here. And we carry that minimal greenbelt space all along this segment of the corridor.
All right, thank you, Karen. So we're going to jump now back into concept 2 and take a look at how it looks east of the East Avenue intersection. So it is worth noting that while the cross section shown at the top of the page represents the majority of the corridor, it's not indicative of the entire length. It is just kind of the most that is going to be seen here. And you can see in the graphic that, for instance, east of Campus Kitchen, we have a wider greenbelt, which will allow for tree plantings for a portion of this segment, but then the tree belt and even the grass strip narrow completely around the curve, as Karen just touched on in concept 1 as well, due to the adjacency to the Greenmount Cemetery and potential slope impacts, as well as archaeological impacts. The grass strip does return east of the cemetery, however, it is kept narrow at that 3-foot width. And this is to avoid any impacts beyond the existing backup sidewalks. And while the project team sees that as within public right away, there's something to be said for the fact that the resident utilization of this space is fairly high, whether that is for recreation or parked private vehicles. All right, moving on to concept 3. Just a reminder for mobility, i.e. bicyclists and pedestrians, this cross-section is generally the same as concept 2. The big difference comes with attempting to address the need for parking for residents and parking to support local businesses along this segment of the corridor. So we can see here in concept 3, the balance of trying to implement the on-street parking while maintaining consistent facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians. Given the presence of businesses like Kathy's Flowers and Campus Kitchen, there was an expressed interest for this parking to be located on the southern side of the corridor. So that's what you're seeing here with the enhancements made east of University Road in a few locations. Now, just for everyone's, we're not continuing east because continuing east of concept 3 and concept 3A down the hill, it's the same cross section and layout as concept 2, just to avoid any questions about that. So concept 3A, as conversations developed with Campus Kitchen, it was noted that there was a strong desire to evaluate the possibility of maintaining short-term, high turnover on-street parking immediately in front of their location. And as such, this specialized concept 3A was created. And so concept 3A mimics concept 3 in its inclusion of on-street parking in select lower impact locations, while also pursuing, as seen in this layout, on-street parking immediately in front of Campus Kitchen. Given the need to balance all users in this very tight cross section, this concept calls for a change to the corridor dynamics for bicyclists and pedestrians, as you'll see in between Tidwell Parkway and University Road. Highlighted on this slide is the creation of a narrow shared use and or slow or mixing zone space for bicyclists and pedestrians through the frontage of Campus Kitchen. Given the high vehicular turnover, the project team believes it makes sense to encourage a slow zone at this location anyway. When you think about high turnover parking areas, whether it's pickup drop off or food pickup, which is ever more important these days to try and build in that curbside management piece to the project as we look at them. we see these being 15-minute or 30-minute parking spaces that are primarily having people exit their vehicle, performing a pickup, then entering their vehicle and returning to their trip. So when we look at bicyclist and pedestrian facilities adjacent to that sort of curbside activity, we see a need to slow those users down. Obviously, pedestrians walk at a fairly slow pace anyway, but just to make everyone aware with bicycles coming through the corridor that there's going to be a change in the dynamics of this section. We're going to need you to go slower to maintain and manage safety for all users of this particular area of the project. And this concept in the grand scheme, represents a compromise for all modes in the greater interest of addressing all of the needs of the project.
If I may, a clarification on the cross section. Jason Stuff will notice it is labeled as an 11-foot planting strip, but to be clear, that is not a new planting strip. That is in most cases already what is lawn in front of folks' houses, but is within the right of way.
Yes, that is not to be considered new infrastructure, merely a naming from the software we use to develop the cross sections to depict this project area. Yep. Karen.
All righty. So jumping into concept 4 East, we'll be presenting a shared use path to help accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists on one side of the roadway. So here on your screen, you're seeing a shared use path on the north side of the corridor. This is coupled with a raised separated bike lane and sidewalk on the south side. Putting the shared use path on the north side was in anticipation of slow uphill cyclists. The speed of the uphill cyclists makes mixing the bikes and peds in this section really more tolerable than mixing downhill cyclists and peds together, given the rate of speed of downhill cyclists, especially in this steep segment, particularly in the steeper segment that we'll see on the next screen. And in this section, the back of sidewalk in this concept is generally within 1 to 2 feet of the existing back of sidewalk along this entire stretch. So the impacts do reach beyond the existing back of sidewalk, but the impact is pretty minimal. Again, 1 to 2 feet to better accommodate that mixed shared use path on the north side. And here's a continuation of that concept down the hill towards Winooski. The shared use path here is on the west side or the uphill side. Again, it's more desirable on that side given the speed of cyclists getting up the hill there and pedestrians walking along that section. And again, this would accommodate that separated bike lane on the west side. So the downhill cyclists would be still separated from the pedestrians. And again, in this cross section, the design would stay within 1 to 2 feet of the existing back of sidewalk. So we attempted to minimize the impacts to that front yard or off-street parking space that folks are utilizing. We will see 1 to 2 feet of impact beyond where the existing back of sidewalk is out there today.
Before you go on, Drew, just so that you can be thinking of this, Karen just touched on it on that alternative. There've been a number of questions about what the resulting, although the impact is in the right of way, what is the resulting in each section for each concept, how much beyond that the existing back of sidewalk we're going, so that they can really do a comparison of how it's going to feel to their front yards. Just so you know, as you go through that, that's kind of a question that they'd like to understand based on concerns of it coming closer to the houses and to the parking spots, to just really understand how the options differ.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Jen. So bear with us here. There's going to be a few lengthy slides as we compare these 5 concepts for the eastern section of the corridor. As we mentioned earlier, the evaluation of these for the west end, the evaluation matrices developed compare each of these eastern corridor concepts across the 4 same factors being cost, safety, overall impacts to the built environment, and community character. So the costs are once more presented on a relative scale. For this assessment, concept 1 was evaluated lower on the scale, as the only significant impact is the widening of the curb width and residual work that comes from that, whereas concepts 2 through 4 include that work in addition to establishing new raised and separated facilities off the street, as we have seen. Now looking at safety along this eastern section of the corridor, in general, the concepts are providing improvements over the existing conditions because we are providing a separation of all various modes. Now, as you'll see here, there are slight discrepancies looking at concepts 3A and 4. Concept 3A, as we discussed, brings in the trade-off of accommodating additional parking with creating a shared slow mixing zone for bicyclists and pedestrians across that frontage. Similarly, concept 4 has a shared facility along the north side for bicyclists and pedestrians. And as a result, we're calling this out as a combination of no change / a slightly worse case for pedestrians for these concepts, based on the fact that in the existing condition, pedestrians have their own space along the sidewalk and bikes are generally operating in the street. Now, we all obviously recognize that some cyclists choose to ride on the sidewalk. However, in looking at kind of apples to oranges here, we do need to fully assess the changes based on the existing environment and the existing corridor accommodations for modes based on what's being proposed. And lastly, all concepts represent an improvement to vehicular safety, given that the travel lanes are now exclusively for vehicles. The impacts of the corridor concepts on the eastern segment are fairly consistent across the concepts as well. As we've touched on, all concepts will have impacts to utilities and will require significant relocation and reconstruction. In this assessment, evaluating parking and right-of-way impacts go hand in hand in a way. As we've discussed, while none of the concepts being considered have actual right-of-way impacts, concepts 3 and 3A naturally require more space to accommodate on-street parking alongside the proposed multimodal facilities. So kind of touching on Jen's question, in this case, we're looking at 7 to 8 more feet of impact in those locations. Now, those were deliberately chosen to be located in areas of lower impact, but there still is that increased impact to that space utilization based on the need for park. These locations do not encroach into private parking, but rather impact space within private right-of-way, as we touched on, being utilized by residents. Regarding impacts to trees, all concepts are anticipated to have some level of impact, with concept 3 and 3A again presenting slightly more significant impacts given the need for more width. Just to reiterate, the community character is really focused on the question, does the concept improve the aesthetics of the corridor and meet the preset project purpose and need? We see, for the most part, yes. Obviously, again, in concept 1, given that the improvements are predominantly striping and pavement markings, there's no change to the aesthetic, but across the board for all the other concepts, we see improvements being made. This satisfies the perfect purpose and need statement is met across the board with a yes. However, there are asterisks on concepts 1, 2, and 4, and this is in regard to parking, which we've called out here. The existing on-street parking that exists along Colchester Avenue is either reduced or removed in all of these concepts, with concepts 3 and 3A retaining some of this on-street parking. And we're calling this as an asterisk because it has been identified that business parking needs to be further addressed as these conversations continue. Now, some of those conversations have happened, and we have identified potential for additional parking opportunities adjacent to the corridor, but we are flagging these concepts 1, 2, and 4 with an asterisk pertaining to the addressing of the parking need in the purpose and need statement. All right. And so before we jump into the intersection alternatives, excuse me, Jen, I already see she's come off mute, which to me suggests there are.
We do have a list. So I do think you kind of clarified a little bit about what the impacts would be along the different sections as to impact. There was a follow-up question that actually connected as well to trees as to kind of which section has tree impacts, where those tree impacts might be that you think may be happening. And I don't know if you have additional information to provide on that.
I know, Karen, do you have anything to weigh in on here?
Yeah, I guess I can just give some clarification around what we were considering moderate or major impacts to the existing trees that are out there. So, you know, the range of 6 existing greenbelt trees, 4 trees that are behind the sidewalk in the existing condition, that was considered a moderate impact. So, you know, there is going to be an impact to the greenbelt and the trees that are existing in the greenbelt in some locations based on, again, that relocation of curb and the significant work that would go into that. But really the impacts beyond the back of walk were limited at most to 4 trees being potentially impacted. And then to give you a sense of what we're saying are major impacts, you know, in that case, we're talking about 11 greenbelt trees along the entire corridor being impacted with that pretty significant curb work to shift curbs around and get curbs in a more desirable location. And then as many as 10 trees being impacted behind the sidewalk or the existing sidewalk. And just to give you a sense to, you know, this would definitely need to be evaluated by, you know, arborists beyond the capability of site walk and identifying those locations, and would definitely depend on that preliminary design where, you know, we would be able to limit those impacts potentially. But that was an evaluation of, you know, the existing trees that are out there and our sense of where they may.
Karen, I just lost your sound for a moment. Are you speaking again?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're back.
You're good.
Excellent. Okay. So that's just to give you a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about moderate versus major for these alternatives.
We had a couple of questions really raised specifically about that mixing zone, I believe, in front of Campus Kitchen. One was someone didn't understand where the bikes go during that section. And there was also another question, if there is so much right of way, why couldn't all of that fit within the right of way? There should be room to have parking, the raised bike lane, etc. Was that looked at is the other question.
Yep, I can hit on that. So I think it might make sense just to go back to the slide to answer the can't that all fit in the right of way question. So I'm not sure how big folks' screens are, but if you can identify the Campus Kitchen location, it is 2 blue rectangles, also known as parcels, over from the University Road label. And to the east, you can see kind of what that space allocation would look like if we maintained on-street parking, the grass strip, the separated bike lane, and the sidewalk. And now if you were to just picture that shifted west to being in front of Campus Kitchen, you really wouldn't have any frontage left, and people would be walking within a few feet of the entrance to Campus Kitchen. Now, as it currently stands, there are a couple picnic tables out there. There's also a driveway used by the owners for loading and unloading and parking during business hours and otherwise. So it would be a bit too crammed there. So there was a desire to kind of maintain as much of that space as possible in this particular location, which is why this slow mixing zone was considered, in addition to the anticipated higher curbside activity at this location relative to the other locations along the corridor, which are primarily residential.
Again, for clarification, in the mixing zone, the folks that are in the separated bike facility are then traveling in the same space as the pedestrians.
Yeah, similar to the existing path west of East Avenue, the new path, you know, a shared use path sort of condition through that area.
Another concern that was brought up on that shared use path idea is the fear, will some people think of that as a cycle track if it is wide enough? Is there any concern by the project team that folks might use it to travel in the wrong direction? Not necessarily down the hill, but perhaps in kind of the more flat area once you get to the top of the hill.
I think with any facility, there's concern that it will be used incorrectly. You know, salmoning is the proper term, riding in the contraflow direction. We hope that this would be mitigated by the fact that there would be a well-established separated bike lane on the opposite side of the road. And in this location, there is a crossing right at University Road that has an RFB, so it'd be fairly easy to navigate to the other side of the road for westbound cyclists. That question would also, you know, at that point, I don't know if we'd be anticipating if westbound cyclists would be coming from east of Colchester Avenue, where the separated bike lane still exists on the opposite side of the road, or if they'd be coming out of University Road. But the hope is that, you know, it would be known that there is a separated bike facility on the opposite side of the road in the appropriate level, in the appropriate direction of travel.
There was also a concern, does the city have a plan for how to maintain the protected bike lanes during the winter?
Might that be, I don't know if Nicole would want to step in with that, or that might be more appropriate in the general discussion at the end of the presentation.
That's up to Nicole, if you'd like to answer it now, or if we should get into that later.
I can probably give a quick answer now. Yeah, we do have, you know, a plan that's still kind of in development because protected bike lanes are still fairly new for Burlington, but we do meet with our maintenance team regularly. We have a meeting at the beginning of every winter to kind of evaluate what our plan is for the coming season, but we do maintain our protected lanes with the same sidewalk tractors that we use to clear our sidewalks. We have a couple of new sidewalk tractors this year. They're going to try a slightly different plan for clearing them. And as of last year, we have a new strategy for actually removing the snow in the protected lanes instead of just plowing, which is what we had done in the past. So work in progress, but definitely something we are focusing on and trying to improve every year.
A couple of other clarifying questions. When you say that trees are impacted, does that mean removed? And I think I can answer that at this point, we can't say for certain because this is a planning level study. There is not detailed survey, and there also has not been an arborist to take a look at what the root situation is on all of those trees. But we just, those are the trees we as a design team would be concerned about. We know there would be some impact to them, and we would have to get additional information to clarify exactly what that impact would be. There is there is some feedback and comment, which I'm going to save and allow people to give kind of when we get to that section. But if there was clarifying, do we have a clarifying thing is, I guess it's more a question. I'm not sure if this is appropriate, but whether there is feedback or data indicating that a mixing zone does work well for a cyclist, that you would say that it is a good option for a cyclist is kind of the question. Have you seen that used other places, Drew, where you would say that the mixing zone is a good option for a bicyclist?
As far as a transition from a purely separated bike lane and a sidewalk adjacent to each other, navigating into a very specific short segment of shared space, then separating back out, the short answer is no. I don't think that. I think that is a condition saved for an extremely contained environment. Now, looking at this corridor in particular, you know, just west of this location, there is the existing shared use path, which is navigated by eastbound cyclists and east and westbound pedestrians. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any posed safety concerns. You know, picture that facility at just a bit to the east along the project corridor. It would not be a major concern given shared use paths exist, you know, on UVM's campus, elsewhere in the city. They're not a totally foreign concept. And of course, you know, if such a concept were to be proceeded to engineering design, you know, surface materials would be assessed, how to properly mark and sign for the potentially unexpected condition. That would all be evaluated in the design phase in the hopes of minimizing any sort of as much conflict as possible.
I think someone is trying to gear up for their response to the poll that's coming, because they want a clarification now. Which option allows continuous bike lane down the hill?
That would be every option.
There was also a question, which is an interesting one. Are options 3A and 4 mutually exclusive, or could they be combined into one alternative? I think this goes back to an earlier question about one treatment on the flats and another treatment for the hill piece.
Yeah, 3A could, the difference between 3A and 4 on the south side of the road is negligible, because you know, that concept 4 could exist on the north side of the road while concept 3A still exists on the south side of the road. I think that would be further developed in kind of a potential engineering design phase of the project. You know,
Okay.
that's a post study question.
All right, hold
But
on.
yes, they could coexist.
Just checking to see if there's any other clarifications on this. Oh, there actually was one question about why did the drive lane width vary? Why is it up to 12 feet in concept 3A? And I can answer. I know in some situations we did have a drive lane width of 12 feet because that is a minimum if there is a hard curb running up right next to it. But was there a reason, Drew, in that location?
I believe that along this tighter section and the continuation down the hill, you know, the awareness of the proximity to the hospital and emergency vehicles using this corridor often with very high frequency, accommodating that little bit of extra space in the travel lanes to be able to have folks be able to pull over and still get those emergency vehicles along this stretch, I think was a concern that was raised early on in the process, and we're conscious of it when we were laying these out.
There was also a clarification earlier, and I apologize for not noticing it. How do bikes enter and exit the separated bike lanes? And I believe, Drew, I believe you touched on it a little bit, but did you want to touch on then again, how do bikes enter and exit separated bike lanes?
Just to make sure I fully understand the question, it might help to have that person who did ask that question unmute. I don't know. And
okay, that would be
ask you-
Andrea Todd.
Andrea would, I don't know if we can unmute Andrea so she could just clarify
Andrea,
the clarifying question.
Andrea, you should be able to go ahead and unmute now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I guess my question is, at the points of the shared use, like, or where you enter and exit those lanes, where do you enter and exit them? Like going up Colchester Ave or going down Colchester Ave is like a commitment. So how do you decide which you're committing to, and how do you decide if you like if you wanted to, how do you enter those separate lanes? And then how do you exit them?
I guess, are you referring to like if you're coming from a side street or seeking a side street destination?
Yeah, I'm actually even thinking like that mixing zone is totally stressful, and I would avoid that. I would rather ride in the lane like I do on Pine Street rather than in a mixing zone. And so if I wanted to exit and get in the street at the mixing zone, how would I exit the path?
So this is pertaining to say, concept 3A as shown here.
Yeah.
So in that specialized case, you would do as you just said, you know, at Tybalt Parkway, you would enter the road, bike in the lane, and then re-enter at University Road.
So you have to wait to, I guess if it's a continuous lane for bikes, where you have to wait to a street entrance to exit it?
Yes.
Generally, yes.
Yes, or a driveway. I mean, I don't know that that's the right answer, but on a driveway, you could go down or up, but typically it's
Yeah.
at side streets where the ramps, you know, are set up to allow you to.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, so perhaps this is a better example. You can see ultimately, you know, driveways and intersections would provide you your reprieve to enter and exit the facility while traveling along it. Karen, did you have?
Yeah, I was just going to add that we were careful to give some sort of apron across from the side streets that aren't at, you know, a four-way intersection, just so that folks could have that access to, you know, get in and get out, as you're referring to. So the example there on the screen, sorry, it's very small on my screen.
Yeah. At Tybalt
North of
University
Tybalt,
and Mass.
Yeah, north
Yeah.
of Tybalt, we would have an apron there, so you could, if you were coming off of Tybalt Parkway, you know, make that left-hand turn and get on to the bike lane on the far side.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
There still seems to be a concern about the 12-foot lanes. The 12-foot lanes are used in any situation in which there is not a bike lane when there is a hard curb at the outside of the lane. It is important for emergency vehicles to have a full 12 feet. Now, when there is a buffer for a bike lane next to the vehicles, that does provide them with that additional, say, foot of width for, think of the fire truck's mirrors, for example. So I know we keep getting that question. It's come up a couple of times. Speaking to emergency response, in places where there is hard curb, the minimum amount of width needed to be 24 feet. That was one of the parameters for laying out these concepts. So that is why the concepts are laid out that way. We did have one request would be, Drew, would you mind very quickly just flipping through the alternatives? You don't need to speak to them, but just so people can remind themselves of which was which before you poll.
Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so starting with concept 1, east, our on-street bike lanes. Concept 2, east, our raised and separated bike lanes. Concept 3, east, raised and separated with the enhancements in the interest of maintaining parking. 3A is the specialized concept with the enhancements to maintain parking and add short-term high turnover parking immediately in front of campus kitchen. And concept 4 is raised and separated bike lanes in the eastbound direction and a shared use path in the westbound direction. And now I will ask Matt to display the poll. And it looks like that is now live. If you could provide your gut reactions, please.
And they are fast and furiously, Drew. Well, they still remember which concept was which.
Yeah.
The responses are coming in.
I appreciate that question. It was like they knew
That was good, yeah.
homework coming.
Yeah.
Pop quiz.
Run through the candidates one more time.
All right, we're already past 60% participation.
Wonderful.
70, huh?
Bit more of a split this time.
So we'll give it another 15 seconds or so. A minute seems to kind of be the magic number here. Got about 5 seconds left to vote. And we'll go ahead and close the poll and let me share the results.
All right.
Great.
Thank you,
all.
Matt, and thank you all for your responses.
Okay.
So now we are going to shift into a look at the alternatives at the Colchester Avenue and East Avenue intersection. Hopefully you're all still with us. And the first alternative we're going to look at, staying on theme, is the lowest overall impact option, which in this case are equipment and striping upgrades to the intersection of Colchester Ave and East Avenue. Now, Karen will get into this a bit more in a few slides, but in evaluating the crash data for this intersection, which is considered a high crash location, the majority of crashes that occur here are rear end type. And generally, this is indicative of poor signal visibility, signal head, signal face visibility at the intersection. Through our investigations to date, we found that the signal equipment at this intersection relative to the lane configurations and their alignment is not up to standard. So this first alternative proposes relocating the signal equipment as well as providing more bolstered pavement markings to improve the conspicuity of other modes at the intersection. Alternative 2 is we'll look at is slightly more intensive, involving a realignment of East Avenue as well as signal relocations and upgrades at the intersection, as well as a very important change to the bicycle lane configuration at this intersection. So as we know, there's a less than desirable skew at the intersection, and this alternative proposes to realign East Avenue, bringing it to 90 degrees with Colchester Avenue. This will help in addressing visibility concerns, as well as concerns about the speeds at which left turns are made from Colchester Avenue onto East Avenue. There's also, as you'll see on the north side of the intersection, a realignment of the north side of the intersection onto the UVM Trinity campus in that location. And the other significant change that will have a major impact, we think, on bicycle comfort and safety at this intersection will be the design to keep bicyclists separated in the bike lane to the right of the travel lanes. Now, those that currently bike the corridor know that in this case, there is a short dashed area where vehicles, right turning vehicles, are to yield to through bicyclists, thus creating a circumstance where at the intersection, bicyclists are in between right turning vehicles and through vehicles. This alternative proposes keeping the bike lane to the right of right turns, and this would only be possible through the installation of a bicycle signal face at the intersection and separate bicycle only phase, which are both proposed as upgrades to this alternative. Okay.
All right, and the third alternative for the intersection with East Avenue is similar to the concept that Drew just shared, with the exception of the bike treatment. And so in this alternative, the intersection is realigned and upgraded and with relocated equipment, like in alternative 2. But in this alternative, as you can see on your screen, the eastbound bike lane is brought up to the intersection so that it can navigate the intersection with the through vehicles. So bringing up that bike lane in between the through vehicles and the through lane and the right turn lane. And then those bicyclists would be accommodated at the intersection with the through movement vehicles. In this option, certainly the bicyclist is more exposed than with a dedicated bike signal that Drew just shared with us. And then the fourth alternative for the intersection with East Avenue is carrying forward the concept from previous planning efforts to have a roundabout in this location. The roundabout would also square up the intersection with East Avenue, bringing it closer to a 90-degree angle with Colchester Avenue. And it would realign the entrance to UVM's Trinity campus as well. The roundabout would have, as shown here, an inscribed diameter of 110 feet and formalize the crossings on all 4 approaches. So a little bit different than what's out there today. And would certainly provide, more access in that regard. And similar to the corridor concepts, these intersections were evaluated side by side through the evaluation matrix with cost, safety, impacts, and community character as the metric. From a relative cost standpoint, we're seeing a range of the treatment options from simply upgrading and relocating equipment, sort of represented as the single dollar sign here, all the way up to the significant road reconstruction work that would go into a realignment, and then even more so with a roundabout option.
For clarification, Karen, a question was raised about cost. And there was a question about whether the construction of the entrance road shift on that north leg into UVM in the movement of UVM's EV charging stations, if that was taken into financial consideration. And just to address that, I mean, it did receive the highest rating of dollar signs. So there isn't a higher rating to go to, but we do understand and do want to be clear that the roundabout option will be more costly than the other alternatives.
Absolutely. All right, in terms of safety, for vehicle safety evaluations of these alternatives, we turn back to the Highway Safety Improvement Program evaluation that was conducted at this location. That report, as Drew had mentioned earlier, saw that the predominant crash type was rear end type crashes. These were often occurring when the light has turned red and the second vehicle fails to stop, or when the light has turned green. And these crashes were indicative of that signal head visibility issue. Some other mitigation that was recommended out of that report was to add signal backplates and update the equipment there. Update the pedestal mounted equipment that's out there today. All of the signalized intersection options presented here would update that equipment and help to realign that equipment with its assigned lane, so that when you're sitting there at the intersection, you're facing the signal head on and know which signal is for you as you're sitting there waiting for your turn. The recommendations from the report to realign East Avenue and realign the UVM driveway were also considered in alternatives 2 and 3 here. So that's seen as an improvement. Alternative 4 would lower vehicle speeds and produce fewer conflict points at the intersection. So well documented that roundabouts improve safety in terms of the number of conflict points. Because of this, the roundabout was definitely considered to be a significant improvement over the existing condition. And then in terms of bike safety, the separation of bikes at the intersection through a dedicated signal and phase in alternative 2 would be an improvement over the other alternatives that are presented here. And for pedestrian safety, the signal protected crossings were considered the greatest improvement for safety. So although we're reducing conflict points and providing more access with the roundabout option for pedestrians, having that signalized crossing was viewed as a significant improvement. And in terms of the impacts of the intersection treatments, these were also compared side by side in all 4 cases. There would be major impacts to utilities, minor impacts to the right of way. Most of that is through the impacts on that northern side of the intersection there at East Avenue. For alternative one, this would involve new or relocated mast arm poles and mast arms, and a more minor effort in terms of constructability. For the other alternatives, the major road work required for realignment or roundabout development would be pretty significant. For the realignment and the roundabout intersection treatments, there would be a reduction of 2 to 3 parking spaces along East Avenue, right near the intersection there. And minor impact to trees. There are 1 to 2 trees that are really close to the intersection there. And so it's anticipated that there would be impacts to those 2 trees in the area immediately around the intersection. And then it's important to note that there was an archaeological assessment of the corridor, and that had recommended that areas along UVM Trinity campus frontage there, any impacts beyond the existing back of sidewalk really should undergo an additional review, just as that was identified as a sensitive area. Not necessarily anything known, but just to have folks looking at that if there are impacts beyond the back of existing structures.
I'm ready for some, oh, sorry.
Not quite yet. The alternatives that leverage curbing to separate facilities and provide greenbelt space were considered improvements to the aesthetics of the corridor in this, or excuse me, to the intersection in this case. So that was an improvement for alternative 2 and alternative 4. All of the intersection alternatives would satisfy the purpose and need, particularly in terms of safety. The upgrades to equipment, striping would address the primary recommendations from that Highway Safety Improvement Program report. And then the realignments in alternatives 2 and 3 would follow through on the secondary recommendations from that report. So really the focus on safety at this intersection. All of these alternatives would help to satisfy those recommendations. And then the roundabout alternative would similarly provide significant improvements to safety at this high crash location intersection.
Hey, Karen, can I just ask a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to go back, you can stay where you're at as far as the slide goes. But I had a question come in over email, and I was just wondering, thinking that now might be the right time to address it, just the traffic performance of the roundabout compared to the signalized intersections. I think people kind of know what the congestion looks like today on a daily basis with the signal, but this person was specifically curious as to how the roundabout would perform comparatively.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and certainly in the existing condition, the delay, particularly for folks on East Avenue, is pretty significant, and so overall, the intersection in the existing condition doesn't perform all that well. But the roundabout would be a slight improvement over the existing condition in terms of the level of service, so level of service C for the roundabout that we've laid out. And, you know, it would improve upon the condition for the approach that sees the most significant delays. So in terms of, you know, the experienced delay waiting for that signal, in the existing condition, it would be an improvement over the existing condition.
Thanks.
Ready for additional questions? The first one was the one that was brought up earlier, which is if I am a cyclist heading westbound, how do I turn left to go on to East Avenue? On any of these alternatives. They understand how on the roundabout, but how do they do it on the other alternatives?
That would be covered with 2-stage left turn boxes at the East Ave intersection. We would have room to build those in. They were shown in the layout concepts as well. For those unfamiliar with the two-stage left turn box, you would enter it on your green signal for westbound travel. You would queue there out of the way of any conflicting vehicular or bicyclist movements. And then when you would be detected for that southbound movement, and then you would go with this vehicular green for that movement to cross onto East Avenue and head southbound.
Another one is, can alternative one work with separated raised bike lanes?
So just I'll click back to so the intention of this slide at the start was to suggest that the Western concepts are shown grouped with the alternatives to the east and at the intersection that work with those concepts. So in this case, the short answer is no, the on-street separated bike lanes would not work with what's being proposed in the other alternatives. It is intended that concept one works with concept one east and alternative one at the intersection.
Okay. Another clarification that there are some impacts also to Trinity Road at UVM in those EV charging stations, even when that intersection is just being shifted. So just a comment on that as a, differentiator, I suppose. What are the emergency vehicle impacts with option 4, the roundabout? All the ambulance pass through this intersection to get to the UVM Medical Center.
So that was assessed. Oh, do you want me to go or?
Sorry.
Okay, so that was no problem. That was assessed. This question came up at the local concerns meeting as well as our advisory committee meetings, as we do have a representative from the UVM Medical Center on the advisor committee, and we assessed it against emergency vehicular speeds of up to 10 miles an hour can travel through the roundabout, which we see as being pretty analogous with an emergency vehicle's approach to a signalized intersection with sirens and lights blazing. We see as minimal speed differential between the signalized intersection and the roundabout in this case. And the roundabout alternative does have a truck apron, but the 10-mile-an-hour assessment that was done, I believe, does account for avoiding that truck apron as the implication of any vertical deflection for an emergency vehicle is less than desirable.
Clarifying questions on the roundabout. In the separated bike lane options, how do bikes enter and exit through the roundabout? How do bikes get around the roundabout, I guess would be the question. If they're in a separated bike lane, what's happening at that roundabout for the bicyclists?
I don't know if it might help to put the slide up again, but the intent would be for bicyclists to already be in the separated bike lanes entering the roundabout. Otherwise, there are striped bike crossings that can be utilized to enter and exit the roundabout at each leg.
So you would go down, if you were headed eastbound, you would travel a little bit down the East Ave leg and cross.
Can you show that with your mouse? Because it's really what you just described doesn't really explain how where the shared bike lane or where the separated bike lane actually gets you from one side of that intersection to the other. Can you just talk it through with your mouse, showing me where you're going to go?
I unfortunately am just sharing the PowerPoint presentation window for the sake of the public presentation. I'm not sure I can trace with my mouse as a result.
Why don't we attempt to just to describe it? So if you're coming from the west, if you're coming from the UVM Medical Center and you're in that dark gray, which is where the cyclist is traveling,
I can see your cursor.
Yes.
Oh, you can?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you
Hey,
see
Drew,
it?
this is Matt from
Oh,
VHB.
okay.
If you go up to the top of your screen and click on View Options, there's an option to annotate that will let you draw if you'd like.
Oh, that
You
could
can
be
circle
fun.
and highlight.
Let's see this Picasso.
Just remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes. All right. We'll make it green because bikes are green. So as Jen was alluding to, Andrea, to answer your question, if you are an eastbound cyclist, the idea is that you will already be in the separated facility. To continue eastbound, you would, oh, it's a little light. Can you guys see that? You would come down here, and then similar to a pedestrian crossing, you would await for a gap or hopefully a yielding vehicle. You would cross the bike crossing here, and then you would continue up here through the intersection to continue east.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Yep. And then similarly, if you were to turn left, you would travel all the way around the roundabout to then proceed on East Avenue, et cetera, et cetera.
Drew, still on that similar topic, if you are a cyclist, is there enough room? Are the splitter islands wide enough that on my bike, I can make it halfway across before I have to look in the other direction to continue my crossing?
Yes, the medians shown here followed pedestrian guidance for refuge islands, so they are a minimum of 6 feet of space. So if you are on a tandem bicycle, it might be one crossing. However, if you're on a single bicycle, you could queue in that space in the median and then proceed.
One other question regarding safety. Does the roundabout slowing speeds provide safety elsewhere on the corridor in a way that the signalized intersections don't? Does that give it kind of a, you know, when we're thinking about our safety evaluation, is there a kind of a bump for the roundabout as a result? Because it isn't just improving the safety of the intersection, but it could have more of an effect on the corridor.
Karen, you want to take that?
That's a really great question.
Yeah.
So I guess I would anticipate that with a roundabout, you're going to have more free flowing traffic. So if you think of, you know, shorter queues or delays on any of the approaches, just because folks aren't going to be waiting for a signal. So in that regard, it might actually be, you know, folks moving along. But to your point, I think, you know, by design, the roundabout is supposed to slow people down along those approaches. So I think in the immediate vicinity of the intersection along each approach, you'll see reduced speeds, but maybe a more continuous flow of traffic. But then, you know, the other treatments along the corridor are really where we may see a speed reduction as we're sort of squeezing lanes down and you know, limiting how much space folks have when they're in a vehicle. So that sort of narrowing of the roadway has the effect of traffic calming and slowing people's speed. So the combination of both, I think, would ultimately result in some slower speeds along the corridor, but in the immediate vicinity of this intersection with a roundabout, I definitely anticipate that there would be slower speeds.
Another question, if I'm a commuter cyclist, am I likely to be able to navigate the roundabout in the road itself and not do that what can be kind of a cumbersome, you know, movement to do like the crossings as a pedestrian?
By design, there are many examples of roundabouts basically accommodating both. So, you know, for those cyclists that are interested but maybe not bold, those folks can use the crossings that we're showing on the screen here. And then oftentimes as a design element, you can provide access for those bolder, braver cyclists to hop into the roadway there and navigate as a vehicle. So certainly we could accommodate both, but I think that would be more of a design element that would be decided upon in sort of the next phase of a project that was implementing a roundabout.
Right, I think everything else I have now is more commentary and not clarification questions.
I think now we'll take our final immediate response poll for the intersection alternatives, and then we'll open it up for public input and general discussion. And that poll is open.
We're already at 75%.
Everybody felt strongly about this one, huh?
This is great. We'll give it another 15 seconds or so. %89 participation. This is great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. 5 seconds, last call for the 3 people out there who haven't voted. I know at least one of those is a phone user. Okay, we're going to end the poll. And everyone should see the results pop up.
So I think we are ready then to enter our kind of a discussion portion of our evening. I will start by reading what it has already been raised in the chat for either commentary or, yeah, it's mostly commentary, opinions, you know, a little additional information, and then we can open it up to folks if you do have a comment, or I don't know, Matt, if I'm stealing your thunder, because I've had to do a few of these without backup. Matt, would you want to be the one who calls on folks and elevates them, or would you prefer that I do that?
Happy to help out.
Okay, excellent. I'll start by reading the items in the questions and answer. There was a comment from Rick Sharp that there's a concern that 11 feet of public right-of-way is being ceded to adjoining landowners on each side of the street. That right-of-way could be better utilized for public transportation as it was intended. That could allow separation of the sidewalk and the raised bike path on the north side of the street up the hill. In addition, there was, you know, a response to an earlier question about the perception of safety is important because it impacts human behavior, both on a bike and behind the wheel, resulting in situations that can be safer or less safe depending on the behavior. And, you know, Glenn believes there's some literature on that point. It's just something to think about. Peggy had commented back when there was consideration of the shared path, the shared use path option, that could be used by kids riding to Edmonds Elementary or middle school. On the poll, there was a commentary that they wanted kind of a split option, a combination of 3A and 4 for that east section. So a modified option that was not put up as part of a question. The vastly reduced idling and ditching the electronic signaling and reduction in collisions, and the roundabout is the most green option. And a contra opinion to that would be that this opinion is that the roundabout does not have an improvement for cyclists. It is slightly less for pedestrians, at least with a signalized intersection. Bikes and peds can push a button and wait for the light. That there's a concern that the roundabout will be less safe for cyclists and pedestrians. And those are all the comments that are in the chat. Matt, if you want to be the moderator.
Sure. So we can continue to take questions via the Q&A tool, or if you would prefer to speak on mic, go ahead and click that raise hand button and we will unmute folks in the order they come in. We have, sorry, I didn't catch if you covered this. We had a question come in from Andrea about stormwater.
Yes.
Okay, great.
I just saw that one, thank you. If stormwater is not factored into these design at the early stages, it's a shame, because any beautiful, perfect design will be non-functional if there's a storm that fills the road's paths with dirt, leaves, and needles. Yes, that is entirely true. Once this reaches the engineering phase, that certainly would be something that would be considered right away to make sure that there is the stormwater accommodation to handle any of this impervious area. Agreed, Andrea, so noted.
Thanks, Jen. We've got 2 raised hands, and really quickly, let's just remind, we have at least one person out there on the phone. If you'd like to raise your hand, press *9 and we can let you unmute. First off, we've got Rick Sharp. Rick, I'm going to allow you to unmute and you can ask your question.
Yep. As to the roundabout, I always believed that roundabouts were built for cars, not for pedestrians and bicycles. And I think that's true of this one as well. I think you're all used to the concept of desire lines. And I think if you lay the desire lines down on that roundabout, you will discover that people will not be using the crosswalks. They will instead go straight across the roundabout, both on bikes and on pedestrians on feet as well. I think that design forces the bikes out into the traffic, which is exactly what you don't want to do. And therefore, the roundabout is a complete disaster. Probably also costs more than all the other improvements that you're going to make to that Colchester right-of-way combined to put that in. And I think it's very unsafe for the emergency vehicles as well. So I'm very opposed to the concept of the roundabout. The last thing that I think is a big problem, and I'd like you to address it directly if you could, is that if you have signals at all the crosswalks that you can stop the traffic, what is to prevent those crosswalks from being activated and thereby backing up all the traffic so that it goes right around the roundabout and becomes a big snarl?
I think there's a misunderstanding with the roundabout option. Those would not be fully signalized crossings.
You're going to let people cross East Avenue and Colchester Avenue without the ability to stop the traffic?
Well, we haven't figured out the exact approach, and that there might be an inappropriate location for an RFB, but because the pedestrians are only crossing traffic approaching from one direction, and that is not necessarily making a number of turning maneuvers, etc., it is a safer crossing location than many others. So yes, those crossings will not be fully signalized.
That's entirely insane.
We have a little bit more feedback in the Q&A. Anne, who is at 211 Colchester Ave, is concerned that she will have an impossible situation coming out of her driveway because of the roundabout. I don't know, Anne, if it's because the splitter island would be blocking your driveway or what the concern is, because I know obviously if vehicles do queue on that approach through any of the alternatives, it would impact you. But I don't know if the concern is that the splitter island in particular would eliminate you from being able to take a left in and a left out. And some of that we could obviously look at in design, but your concern is noted. Greg has commented that the vast majority of pedestrian buttons in town are not responsive. Would new pedestrian buttons for peds or bikes be any more responsive than the ones that we have now? I think this is kind of a two-part concern. I think this is something that if there are locations where the pedestrian buttons are not working, that is something that you should probably speak to the city about kind of separately offline from this. In any alternative where we would be putting in new traffic signal equipment, though, that would be in any of the signalized alternatives, that would be upgrades of equipment. And so everything would be fully operational and new when it went in. So it would need to be operational.
Can I just add a plug for
Sure.
if that is occurring around the city? C-Click Fix is a great way to elevate that issue to folks at the city to fix any issues with head buttons not activating a crossing.
And that's on the city website, C-Click Fix.
I can share a link.
Excellent. There was a concern raised that Kathy's Flower Shop needs parking for their business. I know Jason, I believe, did a little bit of discussion with Kathy's Flower Shop. Jason, you want to just weigh in on that concern?
Yeah, I can speak to that. We did meet with the one of the owners of Kathy Flower Co. and went over the alternatives with them. You know, in a perfect world, they would appreciate some parking spaces on Colchester Avenue. But at the same time, we're very supportive of the alternatives to make it safer for bicycling on Colchester Avenue. And they also have, during the summer at least, an ample amount of parking on the adjacent street. Is it Latham Court? And that, for the most part, is sufficient for their business needs. And they also have employee parking out back behind their business. Yeah, and largely they were supportive of the alternatives to make it safer for bicycling along the corridor.
Okay, we've got a few raised hands we'll try to get to in order. Jonathan Weber, gonna go ahead and allow you to unmute.
Hey folks, Jonathan here from Local Motion. Is it possible to look at 3A on the campus kitchen section, the E section? So just one of my questions here is, I asked a few questions about the lane widths. Just, it seems like we're so close to having room for the continuous raised bike lane and the sidewalk and avoid this mixed use zone, which seems a little hazardous to me. It's not a compromise we would ever ask of people driving to share their space in that sort of same unpredictable way that I think this will work. Why not narrow the green belts by 1 foot to find that extra 2 feet for the sidewalk and the separated bike lane?
That could certainly be considered.
Cool. Yeah, I think that would be great to look at. And if not that, I agree with the other person you mentioned, maybe looking at the property right of ways. I think achieving that continuous bike lane would be really worthwhile. Beyond that, I think these are really great concepts. I think the separated raised bike lanes are really what this corridor needs. There are a lot of people walking and biking here. There are a lot of new users, as we know, buying bikes as bike shops are sold out. And this kind of infrastructure is really what makes folks feel safe. And we know that when folks feel safe, they're more inclined to ride. And there is a really strong safety in numbers effect. When there are more folks out riding, drivers tend to watch for people riding more. And that really increases the safety. As far as the roundabout is concerned, I do think the splitter island width is worth looking at. There are a lot of people riding cargo bikes, bringing their kids to school on cargo bikes. And those are certainly longer oftentimes than the 60 inches that I think was mentioned for those splitter island refuges. So just some things to look at there. And I would also love to see a way for people riding to merge into sort of that car travel lane so that they don't have to use the crosswalks if they're a more advanced, comfortable rider. So thanks for this work. I think any combination of these improvements with the raised lanes and the roundabout or the bike signal improvements would be really worthwhile. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Jonathan, can I also just provide you, when the idea of a mixing zone was raised, I was very hesitant about it at first. And one of the things that actually made me think it was an alternative worth carrying forward was the fact that there is a lot of friction in that area. There are a lot of people getting out of cars and walking across this bike lane. And if nothing else, whether that alternative gets carried forward, it is definitely something as the design move forward to just think about how we alert the cyclist who might be going a little faster that this could be happening. And likewise, the pedestrian who's crossing that area, that this is an area that, so treating it with a different texture did appeal to me for that very reason. This is really a mixing zone because you do have folks coming and going from the parking and going to get their takeout, et cetera. So we do have a couple of other comments in the chat. One is that the crosswalk buttons should be reachable by someone in a wheelchair. That's a great comment. And anything with a new traffic signal, we would make sure it's ADA compliant, of course, as that gets designed. And that the color of raised bike lanes should be different and very obvious to pedestrians on the sidewalk to avoid that kind of the mixing where mixing is not intended. Those were two other pieces of feedback in the chat.
Thanks, Jen. We still have 3 raised hands left. I'm going to move to Jason next. Jason, you should be able to unmute and go ahead.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so one thing I think we have to consider is that this is going to be maybe a 20 or 30-year investment. And so changes going forward are going to be here for a long time. Some of the details I like to see are maybe some of the behind sidewalk impacts to the individual property owners, property owner in the area. The overlay to the tree impacts. I understand there's some greenbelt impact and as well as ones behind the sidewalk. Just figuring out which trees and letting people know which ones are impacted, I think is important for the neighborhood communication. And overlaying the bus stops and how they work into the plan. I couldn't really see in any of the plans where the bus stops are and how they facilitate into that. I think that needs to be made more clear. As far as my preference, I think bikes versus pedestrians, if you want to call it that, is better than bikes versus cars or vehicles. Keeping a separation between high moving, large vehicles and people on bikes and walking is very important. So I appreciate all the separated options as being viable. And where you can look at it, like it's been brought up, but when it rains, the stormwater down the street is very heavy, sometimes several inches. So whichever one facilitates the best, stormwater, I think that's important. And where you can bury the utilities, that's important as well, because they present an obstacle to the greenbelt space and a number of other things. But overall, I support any number one of the options going forward to improve what's there. But the best one is thinking forward for the next 20 or 30 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Up next, we've got Lonnie. Lonnie, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to unmute.
Thank you. So I heard one comment saying that now that the bikes are going to be in the bike lane, they won't be in the vehicle lanes. And I'm not sure that that's something that's part of the legal framework of Vermont. My understanding is that a bicycle can go anywhere that a car goes on a public road. So there still might be cyclists who want to go really fast, who, if they feel that the bike lane is obstructed in some way or has trash or something, they may still want to be in the bike lane. And I can see that. And so on one hand, they'd have a legal right to that. On the other hand, it would be easy for a car driver to get upset that there's a cyclist in their lane. So I'm not quite sure how to resolve that. But I think that's something you want to consider. And maybe it's a public education or something, I don't know. The second thing is that we're voting now as sort of without the constraints of money. We all know that some of the alternatives are more money than others, but it's not coming out of our pockets when we're voting. So I just would encourage you to take that into account. If we were voting and that included like a tax increase or something, maybe we would vote differently. So I just wanted to point that out also. And the third thing is, I myself voted for the separated lanes, but I would hate to see the separated bike lane that's going down Colchester Avenue turn into a canal when it rains. So stormwater might be a really big deal, especially if the lane is separated and it sort of is turning into a trough. That's it for my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lonnie. Up next, we've got Cyril Flash. Cyril, I'll go ahead and allow you to talk. Should be able to unmute now.
Thank you very much. I definitely like the idea of the background behind all these proposals. In my mind, it's slowing down a major corridor coming into Burlington, whether it's Colchester Ave or Williston Road or Shelburne Road, Main Street. So all these efforts to narrow the road I approve of, and I certainly see the roundabout as one of those infrastructures that will help people realize that coming into our city is not a rush, to get downtown or whatever. So I'm aware that roundabouts are extremely controversial, and they're often, or probably always, the most expensive option. And despite my strong preference for bicycling, this seems to be the one case where I would push for the increased safety for motor vehicles, as I feel that the way motor vehicles behave, affects us all. So I don't expect that I'm ever going to be able to change Rick's mind, or probably Rick won't be able to change my mind. And I think to some extent you can always use different data sets. Certainly, we've got plenty of traffic engineers in our area that are strong proponents, like Tony Reddington. It's just great in my mind, since I happen to live on East Avenue, to see the possibility of one of these safety enhancements be seriously considered. So yeah, I guess I just needed to respond, and I think that's about the end of my focus on safety, and really looking for this to happen in the future, whenever it is. Thanks.
Thank you, Cyril. We have one more raised hand, and whoever you are, you're showing up as a Galaxy S8 Plus. So I'm going to allow you to talk, but if you could just do us a favor and just state your full name so we know who you are, that'd be great. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I didn't mean to be the mystery guest. My name is Sharon Busher. And I wanted to ask you a question. I did listen to the presentation, and now I've heard it a second time, and maybe I've missed it, but it is pedestrian focused also. So the sidewalks all along Colchester Avenue, are they going to be looked at and improved as far as leveling, so that there aren't areas where people trip? I haven't heard any. I've heard, with shared paths, definitely, but I haven't heard any specifics around all of the sidewalks along this corridor being looked at and improved for safety for the pedestrian.
I can go ahead and address that quickly. Just pertaining to this study, Sharon, the alternatives being proposed would result in more than likely a complete streetscape reconstruction, in which case those sidewalks, because in a lot of the alternatives they are being relocated, would be reconstructed, and would no doubt be sure to check all of the required standards in terms of state design and ADA standards.
So, and I thought most of it would be, but I wasn't sure if it would be complete. Like, this is a complete street. I would like to see this a complete pedestrian way. And so I just wanted to understand that and just get that on the record, so that to make sure that I know sidewalks are expensive. I'm not naive in this process, but I would like to make sure that the pedestrian is also given priority here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. We have one more raised hand. Jen, did you want to check in with the Q&A?
Yes, a few things did come in via Q&A. One of the questions is, can bikes and peds be part of the automatic signal at a signalized intersection so the pedestrian buttons are not necessary? And yes, we did analyze the operations of the signalized intersections a number of different ways, and some of which could just be concurrent and come up automatically, or others which are for an exclusive pedestrian phase. So there are a number of options at this intersection, which of course would be fine-tuned if that is a selected alternative as it goes through design, but there are options to accommodate pedestrians in either way. Jenny has indicated she seconds what Jason said about public transportation. As a regular bus rider, it would be very helpful to see how the bus stops interact with these options. Jim has indicated that if we really want to add a roundabout to Burlington, let's try to find somewhere where it makes more sense, like replacing the jug handle or the Shelburne Street Rotary. And that's all the feedback in the Q&A.
All right, we'll go now to Jack Hansen. Jack, I'll allow you to unmute. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. And Jim, we're working on the Rotary for sure. But it's a process. But yeah, no, I just wanted to say I think this is really exciting. I think I often get frustrated that in criteria for these shifts to our transportation infrastructure, there isn't the criteria of the climate crisis, which to me is the overarching criteria that should take precedence in terms of our transportation system and the need to make changes to it rapidly. But that being said, I do think this project is one of the most exciting opportunities that we have and that we've ever had in Burlington for that type of transformative change that would really, I think, shift things in a meaningful way in terms of the way that people are able to get around. I think we need this type of infrastructure, this raised and separated, to really get new people who aren't already out there on bikes, who don't feel safe. And a city like Copenhagen that has tons of these all over the city has 50% of people in that city commuting by bike. So I think this is a starting point, and if we can get this, in this part of the city, hopefully it can spread from there and create a real network and really be a game changer.
We do have another comment in the chat, and it is something that we haven't really discussed during this, but it was mentioned just briefly about ways to accommodate parking that might be lost on the corridor. Jim wanted to just mention the potential for short-term parking in the Centennial North University Road entrance is something that UVM is willing to consider and discuss. This would involve closing the eastern entrance exit and widening the western entrance exit to be two-way. That would allow for more temporary parking spaces on the east side of the parking.
Could I ask?
Go ahead, Jason.
There was a question that came in via email to me in advance of this meeting, and it was, and I apologize if I missed it in tonight's discussion, but it was with regard to the intersection of East Ave and Colchester Ave as to whether the additional crosswalk could be put in at the signalized alternatives. So that would be a crosswalk across Colchester Avenue on the western side of the intersection.
Jason, that ties into my comment a little earlier that yes, there is the potential for crosswalks on all legs of the intersection, but in that case, there would probably have to be a shift to an exclusive pedestrian versus if you were to limit to just one crossing of Colchester Ave, you could create a situation where the crossings could be done concurrently with phasing, which then makes it come up automatically. So that is a detail I think that would be worked out later, weighing whether it's the convenience of having all of the crossings at the intersection and how that then affects how those pedestrians are treated, whether they have to push a button to get an exclusive phase. But those would be details that could be worked out. The answer is that yes, either alternative could work. So I'm confident that that could be, if that is desired, that crosswalk could be put in.
Thanks.
All right.
We don't have any additional raised hands, so we're good there.
Looks like we might have two more comments in the Q&A. Jen, I don't know if we wanted to touch on those.
I'm sorry, my apologies. We do. We have residential shared zone parking for a parking management plan instead of the way it's done currently by street is something that has been brought up in our process as a desired situation, so that folks who currently park on Colchester Ave could park on different streets by zone. Thanks for remembering the additional sidewalk. There's already curb cuts and truncated dome plates for that western side crosswalk. This could and should be considered. And then just a pat on the back for Drew and Karen's presentation. Awesome presentation, and thanks so much.
I had one more question. I know that was probably a great note to end, and I apologize for keeping this going.
You can just say that again when you're done, Jason.
We do have a raised hand as well, Jason. So after you,
okay, I won't be the last one. There was a question about bike boxes at the signalized intersection. Was that something that we talked about tonight, or could we consider it?
Yeah, we did mention 2-stage left turn boxes for consideration, primarily at Colchester Avenue and East Avenue, and then at all signalized and unsignalized intersections along the way. We've created queue space for left turns for bicyclists along the corridor.
Okay. I think specifically interested in, right in front of the stop bar. Are we talking about the same thing?
So I guess bike boxes versus 2-stage left turn boxes.
Yes.
Kind of 6 and 1/2 dozen the other. 2-stage left turn boxes came out as an interim approval from FHWA after bike boxes. Bike boxes have seen some effectiveness, but overall have seen to only address improving bicyclist safety for left turns during a red signal face at intersections. And so there was a desire to create a condition that worked during all phases of a signalized intersection, in which case 2-stage left turn boxes were then researched and then granted interim approval by FHWA. So that has been our preferred design consideration for intersection maneuvers, but we could, if things advance to a design, we would consider all potential improvements for navigating intersections for bicyclists.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have one more hand raised. We're going to go to Greg. Go ahead and unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. There's some really great ideas in here. I just wanted to voice my support of the roundabout option, and it's for a few reasons. One is that I just feel a lot safer when I only have to cross one lane at a time, and especially on that eastbound section of Colchester where it meets East Ave. When you have a dedicated right turn lane, the drivers really do not like to slow down when they have a dedicated turn lane, and this would reduce everybody to one lane, which would I think really help to calm traffic. And I think that Rick's concern about drivers not yielding to pedestrians and bicyclists, I think you could do some things to encourage them to slow down even before they reach those crosswalks. You could raise the crosswalks. You could kind of have the whole thing be one big speed table. I don't know, you all are the engineers, you could figure it out, but I think that could be addressed. So I just wanted to say that I think that would be a great option. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg.
All right.
We do have a little bit more in the Q&A, and we are really up against time here, but I will just go through. There was a thank you for addressing the bike park question, and then a comment that the roundabout reduces 3 different left turn lanes.
All right, well, with that, I'll click forward to our final slides here. In case, I assume everybody can still see the presentation up on the screen. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, thank you for everybody's interest in this project. I think it's clear to see this is a heavily involved public, and it seems like that's what really feeds these projects. That's what keeps them going. So thank you for your extremely thought out questions and great feedback. Also, thank you all for being respectful to one another and to the project team. These forums are always can get heated, and I thought everybody here was extremely respectful of all of the ideas being presented here. So on behalf of the project team, thank you for that. Just looking ahead for our scoping study, the next steps will be to select a preferred alternative. From there, we will have one final, third and final meeting with our advisory committee, in which case we will then have our refined preferred alternative. And with that, we will then bring that recommendation to the Transportation, Energy, and Utilities Committee, as well as City Council for their approval. We did have, I know we are over time, we did have final poll questions. I don't know, Jason and Nicole, to revisit the selected alternatives. I know at this point, I think we have had a few people drop off. I'm not sure if it is appropriate to ask those questions or what. Just figured I'd gauge people's thoughts on that. Do we want one final poll for people's preferred alternatives?
A good question. I think my guess is, judging by the comments, and since we've lost, several of our attendees, I didn't get a sense from comments that people necessarily changed their mind based on our additional conversation. So I feel like the information that we got from the initial poll, it's probably good. And we're, being respectful of everybody's time tonight, don't want to belabor that.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Well,
I would say if you had a huge change of heart, please do email me about that, and we could make that subtle adjustment or just kind of note that when we're looking at this, and then preparing to bring this to the advisory committee at their next meeting, which should be sometime in February. We're still trying to schedule that, but just so you're aware of what timeline we're looking at. We're thinking like mid-February, tentatively right now. And just clarification on the last slide, the advisory committee will be making their recommendation of a preferred alternative, and then that will go to the Public Works Commission, the TUC, and then the City Council eventually makes the actual decision there.
Thank you for the clarification there, Jason. And I think with that, thank you all for your attendance. If there are any other closing remarks from the project team, please feel free. Otherwise, we will, as Nicole said, be respectful of everybody's time and let you return to your Monday evening.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the input.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.